Hello and welcome back. This is Mr. Arvites. We're looking at U.S. history. We're talking World War II, and we're looking at 1942 and 1943 in the Pacific. Now, in previous lessons, we looked at Pearl Harbor. This was a devastating attack by the Japanese. It devastated the U.S. Navy. It really catapults the United States into the war. Prior to that, there really was not a push to have the U.S. into the war at all. But if we look at what happened after Pearl Harbor, I think that's more important. Sure, December 7th, 41 is really horrible. December 8th and the ensuing weeks are going to be even worse because the United States is going to lose various battles at Guam. The Philippines are going to be taken, and it is a wholesale loss for the U.S. Armed Forces. And in a lot of ways, I think psychologically the United States is going through a period where, do we know if we can win? In modern times, it's very easy for people living in the United States to think, well, we have the largest, most well-funded military on earth. We can beat any, opposition. In 1942, the Japanese were that opposition. And when you look at their holdings, right, by 1942 into April and May, it is astronomical, right? They're all the way down to the Solomon Islands, bordering Australia. And it's going to be a little while before the United States can actually turn the tide on them. And so what we're going to talk about in this section is how the U.S. is able to turn the tide, and then really what was 1942 all about? Because in a lot of ways, we could not beat the Japanese yet. We needed to have a holding operation. Now, there are people in the Japanese military and the Japanese government who also understand this, and they realize that the United States, because of its geographic location, because of its economic capabilities, if left untouched, would be able to rebound and ultimately oversupply and defeat the Japanese Empire. And so there's going to be a push from Japan in 1942 to land that knockout blow. They thought Pearl Harbor might be the knockout blow in the ensuing invasions. They need to get another one. And so that's going to be the goal for the Japanese in 1942. For the United States, it's going to be holding on. It's going to be making sure that that Navy is still available and making sure that the Army is available to fight as well. Because we have to, obviously, we had in 1940, we start our peacetime draft, but we have to train soldiers, outfit soldiers, and get them prepared. And this is going to be all hands on deck. And so today, we're going to be looking at the Battle of Midway as our first topic, and that is a really big one. But before we get to Midway, I think it should be brought up because it's often not brought up, is the Battle of the Coral Sea. The Battle of the Coral Sea takes place, a little bit around a month before Midway in 1942. But the Japanese are slowly advancing, and they're advancing towards Australia. And the idea when they attack Coral Sea is to take away the ports in Australia, and that's where the U.S. base of operations is going to be in the war in the Pacific. So you could almost look at Coral Sea's importance as similar to that of the Battle of Britain. If the British had fallen during the Nazi Blitz of London, we can't defeat Germany without a landing pad, and we needed England to be where all of the supplies went and everything else. We also need England as an ally. In this case with Australia, and Australia contributes a lot in the war as well, we need that ally, and we also need that base of operations. Island hopping doesn't work if we can't start from that big island continent, right? And so as the Japanese go to attack Coral Sea, this is going to be a unique naval battle for a couple of reasons. One, it's a large naval battle by modern estimates. But it's also the first time where both sides only use planes in the naval fighting. There is no ship-to-ship contact at Coral Sea. The battle itself, I mean, I don't want to get too statistical on it, but more or less it's a draw. The United States doesn't lose anything; they get carriers severely damaged, the Yorktown, right? But the Japanese are stopped, and they lose a little bit as well. And so both sides will kind of claim victory. From a morale standpoint, Coral Sea, I think, is a naval victory for the U.S. because it's the first time we've been able to resist the Japanese and push them back. And it does represent the halt of effective offensives by the Japanese. Though, as we'll see with the Battle of Midway, Midway is going to be that attempt. Okay? So let's get started and look at Midway. So why Midway? Japanese Admiral Yamamoto understood a little bit about the United States. He had actually visited there a number of times, studied there. He'd done joint military operations in the past. The U.S. and Japanese navies in the 30s had some interesting relations, to say the least. But either way, all that aside, Yamamoto understood that the United States had a capability to produce weapons on a scale that was unrivaled. And he really did believe that if this war did not end quickly, Japan would not be able to win. He didn't think his country could sustain an elongated war. Now, I want you to think about this in a couple of perspectives. One, Japan is already in a long war, right, with China. And that war has been resource dependent. It's really drained the Japanese of resources. There's over 1 million Japanese soldiers in China at this point in time. And so they're already in this elongated war. If you get into another one against the United States, who he knows has the ability to reproduce ships, produce more ships, bring over more and more people. It's a population much larger than Japan's. He feels that Japan would probably lose an elongated war and that it would bring mass suffering to the Japanese people. So Yamamoto's plan is to lure out the United States carriers and destroy the United States carrier fleet. And this is a secret operation, as we know, and this is going to go forward. Now, Pearl Harbor, going backwards, was probably one of the largest intelligence failures of the entire war for really anybody. Outside of Stalin's intelligence failures at the beginning of 1941 or 40 in 41, Pearl Harbor showed the Navy not listening to intelligence. Well, Midway is going to be the Navy's coming out party for intelligence. And really, for a long time at this point, the Americans had been working at cracking the Japanese military code. And this was something that it's put a lot of money into, but intelligence is very imprecise. Interestingly enough, the movie Midway that came out about 2 years ago does a decent job of displaying this. Because really, it's a lot of guessing and then making inferences. And so we get a lot of chatter on the radio, and the things that we can digest, we know that there's a Japanese offensive coming, and we know there's a movement coming. Now, here's the thing. The United States is very limited on carriers. So if we commit our carriers in one direction and it's wrong and we lose, the whole thing could be up. If we don't have any carriers protecting our fleet, this is going to be a disaster for the U.S. Navy. So it's imperative that we broke the Japanese code. And in 1942, we're going to more or less do that. So we have been getting a lot of radio traffic from the Japanese, and we're deciphering, percentages of it, not all of it. And so we know an attack's coming, and so we're going to put out what are essentially like fake intelligence things. And so one of the things that we put out was that there was no water at the island of Midway. And we wanted to see if Japan would respond to anything about that island. Now, we did this with other islands as well. And so we get a message from the Japanese that says there is no fresh water at AF. AF is going to be the Midway Code. Okay, and so at that point, we know what Midway stands for in their code system. This allows the United States to predict the Battle of Midway. This is really important because, it's so successful that they predict the day that the attack's going to happen, into the hour the attack's going to happen. We know what carriers are going to be there. We know the whole thing. And the Japanese didn't suspect that we had broken this code, so they did not keep the same radio silence that they kept going into Pearl Harbor, because that was a big time thing on radio silence. And so we have a good understanding of where they're coming from. Now, we do not know where the aircraft carriers are, and this creates one of the biggest, most, I think, important cat and mouse games of the entire war, where both navies, both aircraft carrier groups, are going to be sending out squadrons to spot the opposing side's aircraft carriers. Now, the Battle of Midway is going to start with the Japanese bombing the actual island of Midway. And there's great footage from this because there was a documentary being filmed on Midway at that time. And so there's great footage that you can find of the Battle of Midway, at least the starting points of it. Now, for the United States, we are now going to have to figure out where this fleet is. And so we're going to have to send out scouts to find it. And this creates one of, I think, the more interesting parts of the war. And obviously, if you've seen the Battle of Midway, the movie Midway, you get McCluskey and you get these guys. And essentially, these pilots are in the air, right? And they're flying these stories, these missions to find these, the Japanese fleet. And they're not seeing anything. And again, the Pacific Ocean is this massive ocean, and it's hard to find one ship in that ocean. And if you go in the wrong direction, you're kind of messed up. And so they're gonna hit a point where McCluskey's gonna have to make a decision. Do I turn back, or do I keep searching for a little longer? Well, he decides to keep searching for a little longer. And what they find is a Japanese ship that is behind the normal fleet, and it is going full tilt in a certain direction. And so they're going to say, well, let's see where that ship's going. And they're going to fly over it and go in the same direction. And sure enough, they are going to spot the Japanese fleet. Now, at the same time, the Japanese will also be spotting the American fleet. And so this is going to lead to bombings from both sides going in there. Now, the attacks on the USS Enterprise, USS Hornets, USS Yorktown, they're all going to get attacked in this. The Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu are going to be attacked as well. Now, U.S. planes had some interesting aspects to it. We had torpedo bombers. Torpedo bombers go low. They drop torpedoes into the water that go across. Our torpedoes were not as... they weren't as good. They didn't function that well. And so a lot of those misfired, meaning they would drop the torpedoes in the water and they would clank off, or they wouldn't detonate when they were supposed to. And so they didn't get direct hits. The dive bombers did, though. And dive bombing, to me, seems absolutely terrifying, right? It is exactly how it sounds. A plane goes into a dive and then lifts up and drops the bomb, and it hits the target. Well, those dive bombers going through flak and everything else are going to end up scoring hits on the Akagi, the Kaga, and the Soryu. They're all going to be set on fire. They're all going to end up sinking. And the Japanese are going to respond with wave attacks at the same time, right? So they didn't have the cover of the airplanes. And so for the U.S., the Yorktown is going to be severely damaged, but still floating, still kind of kicking. A submarine's going to sink the Yorktown a little later on June 7th. But by the afternoon of June 4th, they find the Hiryu, which is the last Japanese carrier active at Midway, and we attack it with everything we got. We bomb the Hiryu, and it is going to sink. We hit it with multiple dive bombs. Now, all of this is crazy because what it does is we have now destroyed the 4 major Japanese aircraft carriers in that portion of the Pacific. These were also the same carriers that were used in the Battle of Pearl Harbor. The other thing that we have to understand, and my students, I mean, sometimes you guys have trouble understanding this, every plane that's still in the air can no longer land for Japan. And so they have to scuttle all of those planes. A lot of these pilots get captured or killed because of this. And so you're talking some of the most seasoned soldiers in the Japanese Naval Air Corps are gone. The aircraft carriers are gone. Yamamoto, who had this kind of like sense of invincibility to him, no longer has that, right? And so he's out. And by the way, Yamamoto is only got a little, about less than a year left to live, as we'll talk later on, because U.S. intelligence is actually going to find that he is on a plane in 1943 escaping an area, and we're going to shoot him down. And that's how Yamamoto gets knocked out the war. But the Battle of Midway did a lot of different things. One, it's a full-fledged victory for the United States. The Japanese lose right around 3,057 men. The United States lose 362 soldiers, 1 aircraft carrier, Yorktown, as we talked about, 1 destroyer, and 144 aircraft. The Japanese lose all 4 aircraft carriers, a cruiser, hundreds of aircraft. Every aircraft they had, obviously, was lost. And ultimately, they lose the battle. This is going to buy the United States time. We needed 6 months. We needed more time to get more aircraft carriers and battleships and personnel there. It gives us that time. And that's the importance of the Battle of Midway. A lot of times people talk about this as being the turning point in the Pacific. It is the turning point in the Pacific. And the reason for it is that it's immensely important. It's what allows the later battles to take place. Now, for the next couple of months, we're going to see kind of back and forth little naval engagements. We're going to see some other things taking place. But really, the United States is garnering troops to expel the Japanese from the Solomon Islands. And that'll be our next topic, is those Solomon Islands, because that is going to be an interesting fight for the U.S. Marine Corps. The Japanese, as we know, indoctrinated to a point to where they create some of the most fierce opponents that any civilization has ever produced in war. So by the time we get to August of 1942, the United States is poised to strike a military blow. Now, the Japanese also want to make this something that the U.S. can't win. And so this is not, I think, like the battles that take place in 44 and 45, where it almost seems like delay actions for the Japanese. In this, the Japanese are going to try and expel the Americans from the Solomon Islands after they land, and they're going to reinforce the island. There's a naval battle that the Japanese actually win in the Solomons that causes the Marines to become completely surrounded. Bottom line, this is one of the most violent battles in U.S. history up until that point. At the end of the day, the Allies lose right around 7,100 men in this 4-month-long battle in the Solomon Islands. Now, the Solomon Islands are some of the worst terrain imaginable, right? This is highly dense tropical environments. So you also have the environment being dangerous to the soldiers as well. And when you read accounts from U.S. soldiers, and if you read, certain books like Anthony Beevor's History of World War II is a good one. If you read those, you hear about soldiers who are getting just sick, viral infections all over, right? And feet infections too. Trench foot becomes a really bad thing as well. There are also animals in the Solomon Islands that can kill you: poisonous snakes, spiders, and of course there are crocodiles. So all of these things lead to some pretty horrific events. Now, as far as the soldiers fighting, the Japanese are going to put everything they can into the Solomon Islands to expel the Americans. But the Marines really hold fast. And one of the things that I think the Solomon Islands shows us, and again, this is a U.S. history class, so we should look at a big trend. The big trend that the Solomon Islands show the United States military is that the Japanese are going to have a steadfast resilience, and they are not going to surrender, and they're not going to give us territory easily. The Japanese will lose 31,000 men in the battle for the Solomon Islands, including 38 ships, 682 aircraft. This is a huge loss for the Japanese. And you're talking 99%, 98% of all the defenders who defended the Solomon Islands die for the Japanese. And the U.S., again, they suffer a lot of casualties. 7,100 men is not anything to scoff at, and that's just killed. But we have wounded and everything else. The Solomon Islands shows us what this war in the Japanese front is going to be. It is violent, it is visceral, and it's barbaric in a lot of ways. And there are some great quotes about this that you can see if you again, any type of book that you want to read on it. But when you think about the Solomon Islands, it's more or less a window into what the future is going to hold. And when you look at battles at Peleliu, or even eventually Iwo Jima, Okinawa, or even the retaking of the Philippines, the Japanese are going to be dug in, and they're going to fight, and they're going to fight ferociously, and the Americans are going to do the same. And it's going to be a matter of grit as to who wins this war. It's really important, though. The Solomon Islands is also our big land victory. We had not had that yet in this war. And when you look at these powers, and we saw the map earlier of Japan and then of Germany, obviously in Europe, there was a fear that maybe our soldiers weren't up to the task, right? The sons and daughters of the Depression, these people who live under this democracy. Can you go against the totalitarianism of Japan? Can you go against the extremism and empire nature of Japan, right? Can you fight the Nazis who have this indoctrinated setting? And we did prove that the American GIs were capable. And they fought just as hard as any soldiers fought. And I know the Marines who fought on the Solomon Islands will say they fought just as hard as anybody who's ever fought in the history of warfare. Because that's what it was all about. Now, the Solomon Islands is going to lead us to a larger trend, and it's going to show us that we cannot attack the Japanese everywhere they are at. Because even if it's a small grouping of soldiers, it's going to take a lot of damage. And that's going to bring us to what is going to be called the island hopping campaign. The island hopping campaign is the proposed plans for the U.S. Army starting in 1943, where we are going to bypass certain strongholds that the Japanese have. We will surround them with naval bombardments, but we're not going to attack them from the land. And we will attack somewhat weaker positions that are strategic. In island hopping, every island that they take provides an airfield. Airfields are important because what we want to be able to do is get our B-17s, our B-24s, and eventually our B-29s in the air to bomb Japan. The only way to do that is to get airfields that go closer and closer. So every island that is hopped provides an airfield for another island. And that becomes the big plan in the Pacific. It's not sexy, it's not glamorous, it's slow, it's deliberate, but it shortens the war significantly because we bypass places like Rabaul. Rabaul was a huge stronghold. Bypass it, right? And so it allows us to advance a lot quicker in the Pacific than we normally would have. So I hope in this video you kind of have an understanding that by the end of 1942, the Japanese are not beaten. And this is not an inevitability. And I hate when people say, oh, it's inevitable because it's just production. That still has to happen. And the fighting still has to occur that allows for the United States to win. But we definitely look at the second half of 1942 as a turning point in the war in the Pacific. The United States has proven that it can go toe-to-toe with Japan. It has proven it can win. It has proven it can win a long, dirty battle like Guadalcanal, and they'll be marching in 43, as we'll see. And then in 43, we will also get offensives in Europe, as you'll see in another video. Well, thank you. This is Mr. Arvites. Have a good day.